The scorching summer sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Copper Creek as Catherine Vaughn swept the wooden porch of her father's general store, her thoughts drifting to a promise made 2 decades ago beneath the old oak tree that still stood at the edge of town. A promise from a boy with wild dreams and kind eyes who had ridden away on a rickety wagon, vowing to return when they were grown. The year was 1885, and at 30 years old, Catherine had long since stopped waiting at the edge of town every spring, scanning the horizon for the familiar silhouette of the boy who had once been her entire world. Life in the Arizona Territory had hardened her in some ways, softened her in others, but the memory of Kyle Fletcher remained like a pressed flower between the pages of her heart, preserved but fading with time. "Catherine," her father's voice called from inside the store. "The Sawyer order needs checking before Mr. Sawyer arrives." "Coming, Pa," she replied, propping the broom against the wall and adjusting her simple blue cotton dress before stepping back into the cool shade of Vaughn's general store. The interior smelled of coffee beans, leather, and the sweet tang of hard candy. Catherine had grown up in this store, learning arithmetic by counting inventory and social graces by greeting customers. After her mother passed from influenza when Catherine was 15, she had stepped fully into the role of shopkeeper's daughter, eventually becoming her father's business partner as his eyesight began to fail. She was tallying the items for the Sawyer Ranch order when the bell above the door jingled. Catherine didn't immediately look up, finishing her notation in the ledger before raising her head. "Be with you in just a moment," she said pleasantly, setting down her pencil. When she finally lifted her gaze, time seemed to stop. A tall man stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the bright sunlight streaming in behind him. He wore a dark Stetson pulled low over his eyes, but there was something hauntingly familiar about the set of his jaw and the way he stood with his weight shifted slightly to one side. "Can I help you find something, sir?" she asked, her voice steady despite the strange fluttering in her chest. The man stepped fully into the store, removing his hat in one fluid motion. Sunlight from the window caught in his hair the color of wheat fields at harvest and illuminated eyes, the precise shade of a summer storm. "I'm looking for something I lost a long time ago," he said, his deep voice carrying the slight rasp of trail dust. "I made a promise to come back for it." Catherine's pencil clattered to the wooden floor. "Kyle," she whispered, her hand instinctively reaching for the counter's edge to steady herself. A slow smile spread across his weathered face, crinkling the corners of those familiar gray eyes. "Hello, Cat." No one had called her that in 20 years. "You're late," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Kyle Fletcher's smile widened as he took another step toward the counter. "I know. I've been practicing my apology for about 15 years now." Catherine studied him, taking in the changes time had carved into the boy she once knew. His face was tanned and lined from years under the sun. A thin scar ran along his left jawline, and his hands, as he placed them on the counter, were calloused and strong. But his eyes, those were the same eyes that had looked into hers under the oak tree all those years ago when they'd made their childish promises. "You actually came back," she said, disbelief coloring her voice. "I promised I would," he replied simply, as if that explained everything. Perhaps for him, it did. The moment was broken by the appearance of Catherine's father, George Vaughn, from the storeroom. At 65, he moved more slowly than he once had, his spectacles perched permanently on the end of his nose. "Who's this then, Catherine?" he asked, squinting at the stranger. "Pa, this is Kyle Fletcher," Catherine said, watching as recognition dawned on her father's face. "Little Kyle Fletcher, Samuel's boy." George peered more closely at the man. Well, I'll be. Not so little anymore, are you? Last I heard, your family settled somewhere in Colorado. Yes, sir. My parents are still there. I've been working cattle drives and breaking horses across 5 territories since I was 16, Kyle explained, extending his hand to shake George's. It's good to see you again, Mr. Vaughn. What brings you back to our little corner of nowhere after all this time? George asked, though his knowing glance between Kyle and his daughter suggested he might have guessed. I made a promise, Kyle said simply, and I've finally made enough of myself to keep it. Catherine felt heat rise to her cheeks. She remembered that promise made with the earnest conviction only children can muster. Kyle had promised to come back for her when he'd made his fortune, so they could have adventures together like in the dime novels they used to read hidden in the hayloft of her father's stable. Well, you've picked an interesting time to return, George said, gesturing toward the door. Town's changing. Railroads coming through next year. Some folks are mighty pleased about it, others not so much. Kyle nodded. I noticed some new construction on my way in. Copper Creek's grown since I left. Not that much, Catherine interjected, finding her voice again. Still the same dusty little town at heart. And what about you, Kat? Kyle asked, his eyes finding hers again. Have you changed much? Before she could answer, the bell above the door jangled again and Sheriff Tom Hollister stepped inside, his usual stern expression in place. Afternoon, George. Catherine, he nodded, then fixed his gaze on Kyle. Don't believe I've had the pleasure. Sheriff, this is Kyle Fletcher, George explained. An old friend returned to town. Fletcher? The sheriff's eyebrows rose slightly. Any relation to Samuel Fletcher, who used to own the South Pasture lands? My father, Kyle confirmed. Interesting timing for a visit, Hollister said, his hand resting casually near his holstered revolver. Just had word that the McAllister gang might be headed this way. Been robbing banks and trains across the territory. I'm not just visiting, Sheriff, Kyle replied evenly. I'm looking to settle some unfinished business. Catherine watched the subtle tension between the two men, wondering what lay behind it. She knew Sheriff Hollister had taken office 5 years ago after the previous sheriff retired, but he'd always seemed particularly protective of her, despite her polite rebuffs of his occasional dinner invitations. Well, Mr. Fletcher, I hope your business concludes quickly and peacefully, Hollister said. Times are changing in Copper Creek. We like to keep trouble outside the town limits. That makes 2 of us, Sheriff. After Hollister collected the ammunition he'd come to purchase and left, an awkward silence fell over the store. So, George finally said, clapping his hands together. Kyle, where are you staying while you're in town? I just arrived. Haven't had a chance to inquire at the hotel yet. Nonsense, George waved dismissively. The Peterson Hotel charges highway robbery prices these days. We've got a spare room above the store. Used to be Catherine's brother's before he moved to California. Pa, Catherine protested softly, but her father ignored her. You'll stay with us, George insisted. Least we can do for Samuel's boy. Your father was a good friend to me before your family moved on. Kyle looked to Catherine, clearly waiting for her input. I wouldn't want to impose. Catherine hesitated, torn between the propriety she'd cultivated as the respectable daughter of a merchant and the wild flutter of her heart at seeing him again. It's fine, she finally said. The room's just gathering dust anyway. Then it's settled, George announced. Catherine, why don't you show Kyle up to Michael's old room while I mind the store? Then perhaps you could give our guest a tour of how the town's changed. I'm sure you 2 have plenty to catch up on. Catherine recognized her father's less than subtle matchmaking attempt, but couldn't find it in herself to object. She led Kyle through the back of the store to the narrow staircase that connected to their living quarters above. Your father hasn't changed much, Kyle observed as they climbed the stairs, still making decisions for everyone around him. He means well, Catherine replied, reaching the landing and turning down a short hallway. He's been lonely since Ma died and Michael moved west. I think he misses having a man around to talk to. I was sorry to hear about your mother, Kyle said softly. My pa told me when he got word. I wanted to write to you then, but you were 16 and working cattle drives across 5 territories, she finished for him, stopping at a door and pushing it open. It's all right, Kyle. It was a long time ago. The room was simple but clean, a single bed with a quilt Catherine's mother had made, a pine dresser, and a small desk beneath the window that overlooked the main street. Kyle set his saddlebags on the bed and placed his hat on the dresser, looking around with appreciation. It's more than I've had in most places, he said. Thank you. Standing alone with him in the small room, Catherine suddenly felt shy, as though they were strangers instead of children who had once known each other's every secret. I'll let you get settled, she said, turning to leave. Come down when you're ready for that tour. Kyle caught her hand before she could go, his touch sending a jolt through her that she hadn't expected. Cat, wait. His voice was softer now, meant only for her. I know it's been a long time, and you probably gave up on me years ago, but I need you to know I never forgot my promise. Not for a single day. Catherine looked down at their joined hands, hers pale and smooth from indoor work, his tanned and rough from years of labor. 20 years is a long time to hold onto a childhood promise, Kyle. Some promises define who you are, he replied, his gaze intense. I had to become someone worthy of coming back before I could face you again. She gently withdrew her hand. We were children, Kyle. We didn't know anything about the world. Maybe not, he agreed. But I knew even then that you were the most important person in my life. That hasn't changed. Catherine stepped back, needing distance from the earnestness in his eyes. A lot has changed, Kyle. I've changed. Whatever you came back expecting to find, I'm not sure it exists anymore. He nodded slowly, accepting her words without argument. Then I'd like the chance to get to know who you are now, if you'll let me. The sincerity in his voice nearly undid her. I'll be downstairs when you're ready for that tour, she said softly, and slipped out of the room before her composure could crack any further. Downstairs, her father gave her a knowing look when she returned to the store alone. He's grown into a fine-looking man, George observed casually. Pa, Catherine warned. What? I'm just making an observation. He adjusted his spectacles. You know, your mother and I were childhood friends too. This is different, Catherine insisted. Is it? George asked mildly. Because the way that young man looks at you reminds me very much of how I used to look at your mother. Before Catherine could formulate a response, Kyle appeared at the bottom of the stairs, having exchanged his trail-worn shirt for a cleaner one, his hair damp from washing. Ready for that tour whenever you are, he said. Catherine nodded, untying her shopkeeper's apron and hanging it on a hook behind the counter. We won't be long, Pa. Take your time, George called after them as they headed for the door. Store's quiet this time of day anyway. The afternoon sun was still hot as they stepped onto the boardwalk, but a slight breeze had picked up, carrying the scent of sage from the surrounding hills. Catherine guided Kyle down the main street, pointing out the changes that had come to Copper Creek in his absence. The saloon's new, she noted, indicating a 2-story building with fresh paint. Built 5 years ago when they discovered a new silver vein in the old Winston mine. The church got a proper bell tower last year, and Dr. Perkins finally retired. We have a young doctor from back east now, with modern training. Kyle walked beside her, close enough that their shoulders occasionally brushed, sending little sparks through Catherine each time. And what about you, Cat? What's changed for you in 20 years? Catherine considered how to answer as they turned onto a side street that led toward the creek that gave the town its name. I help Pa run the store. I'm on the town council now. I teach reading at the school 3 days a week. No husband, children? Kyle asked carefully. She shook her head. No, there were opportunities, but nothing ever felt right. Kyle was quiet for a moment. I'm glad, he finally said. Glad that I'm a spinster at 30, she asked with a wry smile. Glad that you didn't settle, he corrected. You deserve more than nothing ever felt right. They reached the creek, which flowed more strongly than usual thanks to spring rains in the mountains. The old oak tree still stood nearby, its massive branches providing shade just as they had when 2 10-year-old children carved their initials into its trunk. Without discussing it, they both headed for the tree as if pulled by invisible strings. The carved initials were still there, though weathered and partially grown over. KF plus CV. Kyle traced the rough carving with his fingertips. Remember how scared we were that your pa would tan our hides for damaging a perfectly good tree? Catherine laughed softly. And you said it wasn't damage. It was improving the tree by giving it a story to tell. I was a dramatic child, Kyle admitted with a grin. You were, she agreed, leaning against the trunk. Always telling tales about the adventures we'd have someday. I've had a few, he said, his smile fading into something more thoughtful, but they weren't the same without you to share them with. Catherine felt her heartbeat quicken. Tell me about them. Your adventures. Kyle sat down at the base of the tree, stretching his long legs out before him, and patted the ground beside him. After a moment's hesitation, Catherine gathered her skirts and sat down too, careful to maintain a proper distance between them. I started as a cattle hand in Colorado, he began. Worked my way up to trail boss by the time I was 22. Led drives from Texas to Montana, Kansas to California. Saw country you wouldn't believe exists, mountains that touch the sky, deserts that stretch forever, forests so thick the sun barely reaches the ground. As he spoke, his face came alive with the memories, and Catherine found herself entranced by the picture he painted of a life so different from her own. 3 years ago I struck out on my own, he continued. Saved enough to buy a small herd, found good grazing land in northern New Mexico territory. Built it into something respectable. You're a rancher now, Catherine asked. Kyle nodded. Got 500 head of prime beef cattle, a decent house, and enough hands to keep things running while I'm away. It's good land, Cat, beautiful country, the kind of place where you can see forever on a clear day. It sounds wonderful, she said sincerely. It is. He turned to look directly at her. But every time I'd stand on my porch and look out at that view, I'd think about how much I wished you were there to see it too. Catherine looked down at her hands folded in her lap. Kyle, I know, he said quickly. It's been 20 years. We're not the same people. But I made a promise, Kat, and I've worked every day since I left to be in a position to keep it. What exactly are you saying? She asked, though part of her already had known from the moment she recognized him in the store. I'm saying I came back for you, Kyle said simply. Just like I promised I would. I'm asking if you might consider coming back with me, not today or tomorrow, but someday soon. When you've had time to get to know me again, and I've had time to prove that I'm a man who keeps his word. Catherine stared at him, this man who was both stranger and oldest friend. You can't just ride into town after 20 years and expect me to uproot my entire life based on a promise made by children. I don't expect anything, he countered gently. I'm just offering a choice you didn't have before. A different life if you want it. Before she could respond, voices called from down the path. A group of children from the school were heading toward the creek, led by the young schoolteacher, Miss Adams. Miss Vaughn." Several of the children called out when they spotted Catherine. Catherine rose quickly to her feet, brushing off her skirts. Kyle stood too, placing his hat back on his head. "Hello, children," Catherine greeted them warmly. "Having a nature lesson today?" "Yes, madam," replied a freckle-faced boy of about 8. "Miss Adams is teaching us about the plants that grow by the water." Miss Adams approached with a friendly smile. "Good afternoon, Catherine." Her curious gaze shifted to Kyle. "Jenny, this is Kyle Fletcher, an old friend who's just returned to town," Catherine explained. "Kyle, this is Jenny Adams, our schoolteacher." Kyle tipped his hat politely. "Madam." "Mr. Fletcher," Miss Adams acknowledged. "Are you the Fletcher who used to own land south of town?" "My father mentioned that property recently." "My father did," Kyle clarified. "We moved when I was 10. "I see." Miss Adams turned back to Catherine. "Will you be at the school council meeting tomorrow evening? We're discussing funds for new readers." "Of course," Catherine assured her. "Pa and I have some ideas about that." After a few more pleasantries, Miss Adams herded her students further along the creek bank, leaving Catherine and Kyle alone again. "You're good with them," Kyle observed. "The children," Catherine smiled. "I enjoy teaching." There's something special about watching a child's face when they first understand how letters form words, and words open up whole worlds. "You would have made a wonderful mother," Kyle said softly. The comment caught Catherine off guard. "Perhaps someday I still will," she replied, though she'd long since accepted that likelihood was growing slimmer with each passing year. They began walking back toward town, the conversation turning to safer topics: mutual childhood acquaintances, the changes in the territories, the coming of the railroad. By the time they reached the general store again, the awkwardness between them had eased somewhat, replaced by the cautious beginnings of renewed friendship. "Thank you for the tour," Kyle said as they paused outside the store. "And for the room. I promise I won't impose on your family's hospitality for long." "It's no imposition," Catherine assured him. "Pa's delighted to have you, and—" She hesitated, then added truthfully, "I am too." The smile that lit his face was worth the small admission. "Then I look forward to dinner with you both. I should warn you, my cooking isn't nearly as good as my mother's was," Catherine said with a self-deprecating smile. "After years of chuck wagon meals and my own sad attempts at cooking, I doubt I'll notice," Kyle laughed. Catherine found herself laughing too, and for a brief moment, it felt as though the 20 years between them melted away. Then the door to the sheriff's office across the street opened, and she noticed Sheriff Hollister watching them with an unreadable expression. "I should get back inside," Catherine said, sobering. "Inventory won't count itself." Kyle followed her gaze to the sheriff, his expression hardening slightly. "Of course. I'll see you at dinner." As Catherine returned to her work in the store, she couldn't help but wonder about the subtle tension she'd sensed between Kyle and the sheriff. But more than that, she wondered about the feelings his return had stirred in her feelings she'd thought long buried under years of practical living and adjusted expectations. Kyle Fletcher had ridden back into her life with the same determination that had characterized him as a boy, carrying a promise that should have been forgotten years ago. The sensible thing would be to gently but firmly explain that they were different people now, with different lives. But as she mechanically checked inventory and assisted the occasional customer, Catherine couldn't deny the spark that had reignited in her heart, a spark of possibility she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a very long time. Dinner that evening was a lively affair. George Vaughn was in rare form, regaling Kyle with stories of Copper Creek's growth and peppering him with questions about his ranching operation. Kyle answered patiently, occasionally catching Catherine's eye across the table with a private smile that made her cheeks warm. "So you've got 500 head on how many acres?" George asked, helping himself to more of Catherine's beef stew. "About 8,000 acres," Kyle replied. "Good water rights, decent grazing, room to expand when the time is right." George whistled appreciatively. "That's a serious operation." "You've done well for yourself, son." "I've been fortunate," Kyle said modestly. "And I had good teachers. My father, and before that, watching how you ran your business, sir. You always said that honest work and treating people fairly would pay off in the end." George looked pleased at the compliment. "Well, it served me well enough, though I must say, ranching sounds more exciting than selling flour and nails day after day." "It has its moments," Kyle agreed. "But it also has blizzards that can kill half your herd, drought that can starve what's left, and rustlers who just as soon shoot you as look at you." "Life has its risks no matter where you are," George said philosophically. "Even our quiet little town. Just last month, the bank in Silver Springs was robbed that's not 20 miles from here. The McAllister gang," Catherine explained to Kyle. "They've been causing trouble throughout the territory." "Sheriff mentioned them," Kyle nodded. "They're getting bold if they're hitting towns this size." "Railroad money," George said, sitting back in his chair. "Makes for tempting targets, which reminds me, what do you think of our new sheriff?" "Been here 5 years now, came from somewhere back east." Kyle considered his answer carefully. "Seems capable enough, keeps his eyes open." "Especially where Catherine is concerned," George added with a knowing look at his daughter. "Pa," Catherine protested, "Sheriff Hollister is simply doing his job." "If his job is finding excuses to call on you, then yes, he's very dedicated," George chuckled. Kyle's expression remained neutral, but Catherine noticed how his hand tightened slightly around his fork. "Tom Hollister is a good sheriff," she said firmly, "but I've made it clear I'm not interested in his attentions." "Well, he's persistent, I'll give him that," George said. "Almost as persistent as this young man was when he was 10 years old, following you around like a lost puppy." "I prefer to think of it as devoted," Kyle countered with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. After dinner, George excused himself to his favorite chair in the parlor with the latest newspaper, leaving Catherine and Kyle to clean up. As they stood side by side at the washbasin, Kyle washing and Catherine drying, a comfortable rhythm developed between them. "Your father hasn't changed his opinion on the sheriff, I see," Kyle observed casually. Catherine handed him another plate. "Pa thinks Tom is too rigid, too concerned with rules and not enough with people." "And what do you think?" She considered her answer. "I think he's a good lawman. Keeps order, makes people feel safe." "But," Kyle prompted, hearing the unspoken reservation in her voice, "but there's something calculated about him sometimes, like he's always working out how every situation benefits him." She set down the dish towel. "It's probably unfair of me." "He's never been anything but professional and courteous." "Except for the unwanted attentions your father mentioned," Catherine sighed. "Occasional invitations to dinner or church socials. Nothing improper. I've declined," he persists. "Life goes on." Kyle handed her the last clean plate. "And he doesn't strike you as the type to take no for an answer permanently?" "Kyle Fletcher," Catherine said with sudden sharpness. "If you're thinking of doing something foolish like confronting the sheriff over some misplaced sense of protection, you can put that thought right out of your head. I've been managing my own affairs for 20 years without your help." To her surprise, Kyle laughed. "There she is," he said softly. "The cat I remember. The one who once punched Billy Thornton for saying girls couldn't climb trees." Despite herself, Catherine smiled at the memory. "Billy Thornton had it coming." "He did," Kyle agreed. "And no, I wasn't planning to confront the sheriff. I just wanted to understand the situation." His expression grew more serious. "But Kat, if he ever does cross a line, then I'll handle it," she said firmly. "Or I'll ask for help if I need it." Kyle raised his hands in surrender. "Fair enough." Later that night, after her father had gone to bed, Catherine found herself unable to sleep. She slipped downstairs to the kitchen for a glass of water and was surprised to find Kyle sitting at the table, a lamp burning low beside him as he wrote in a small notebook. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked softly, not wanting to startle him. He looked up, closing the notebook. "Old habit from the trail. I don't sleep well the first few nights in a new place." "What were you writing?" she asked, genuinely curious as she poured herself water from the pitcher. "Letters, mostly. Instructions for my foreman, and—" He hesitated, then admitted, "thoughts that keep me awake." Catherine sat down across from him, drawn by the quiet intimacy of the moment. "You've really built a life for yourself, haven't you? A real home." "I have," he nodded. "It's a good life. Challenging, but good." "Tell me more about it," she requested. "Your ranch." Kyle's face lit up as he described the property, the house he'd built with his own hands. Expanded room by room as his success grew. The bunkhouse for his hands, the corrals and barns, the creek that ran through the northern pasture, the distant mountains that turned purple at sunset. "It sounds beautiful," Catherine said when he finished. "You must be anxious to get back to it." "It'll keep," Kyle replied, his eyes never leaving her face. "I've waited 20 years for this. I can spare a few weeks." "A few weeks?" Catherine echoed, surprised. I assumed you were just passing through." "I told you why I came back, Kat," Kyle said quietly. "I'm not leaving until you've had time to truly consider what I'm offering." The intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "And if my answer is no, then I'll respect that," he said simply. "But I'll go knowing I kept my promise and gave us both the chance to see what might have been." Catherine studied him in the lamplight, this man who had once been the boy she'd thought she'd love forever. "You're not at all what I expected," she admitted. "Is that good or bad?" "I'm not sure yet," she replied honestly, "but I think I'd like to find out." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains he'd described. "That's all I'm asking for, Kat. A chance." In the dim light of the kitchen, with the rest of the house silent around them, Catherine found herself wondering what it might be like to take a chance after all these years of safe, predictable existence. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. "Good night, Kyle," she said softly, rising from the table. "Good night, Kat," he replied. "Sweet dreams." As she climbed the stairs back to her room, Catherine knew her dreams would be anything but peaceful tonight. The boy from her past had returned as a man who still had the power to make her heart race, and that was a complication she hadn't prepared for. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Catherine rose early, as was her habit, and was surprised to find Kyle already in the kitchen, coffee brewing and bacon sizzling in a pan. "You cook?" she asked, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. "A man living alone learns to feed himself or starve," he replied with a grin. "I won't claim to be a chef, but I can manage breakfast well enough." George appeared in the doorway, sniffing appreciatively. "Something smells better than Catherine's usual offerings," he teased. "Pa," Catherine protested, though she knew her cooking skills were mediocre at best. "Just telling the truth, daughter," George said cheerfully, accepting a cup of coffee from Kyle. "A man gets tired of burned toast and watery eggs. If my cooking is so terrible, perhaps I should let you fend for yourself," Catherine threatened without heat. "And then who would you practice on?" George countered. "No, no, I'll suffer through it. It's my fatherly duty." Kyle watched their banter with evident enjoyment. "I'd be happy to cook breakfast while I'm here," he offered. "Small repayment for your hospitality." "A man who can cook and has his own ranch." George said to Catherine with exaggerated enthusiasm. "Better snatch him up quick before someone else does." "Pa!" Catherine exclaimed again, her cheeks burning. Kyle laughed, serving up the bacon and eggs he'd prepared. "I'm not going anywhere, Mr. Vaughn. At least, not for a while." After breakfast, they all headed downstairs to open the store. Tuesday mornings were typically busy with ranchers' wives coming to town for supplies, and today was no exception. Catherine was grateful for the distraction of work, though she was acutely aware of Kyle's presence as he helped her father move heavy sacks of flour and sugar from the storeroom. Around mid-morning, the bell above the door jangled, and Sheriff Hollister walked in, his eyes immediately finding Kyle. "Mr. Fletcher," he nodded curtly before turning to Catherine with a softer expression. "Miss Vaughn, I was hoping I might have a word with you, in private." Catherine glanced at her father, who was helping Mrs. Peterson decide between two different patterns of calico. "I'm rather busy at the moment, Sheriff. It won't take long," Hollister insisted. "It's a matter of some importance." "I can mind the counter," Kyle offered, though Catherine noticed the subtle tension in his shoulders. With a sigh, she nodded. "Very well, Sheriff, we can speak in the back room." She led Hollister through the curtain that separated the store from the storage area, conscious of Kyle's eyes following them. "What's this about, Sheriff?" she asked once they were alone. Hollister removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "I wanted to speak with you about your guest, Kyle." "What about him?" "I've been making some inquiries about Mr. Fletcher," Hollister said, his voice low. "Did you know he was involved in a shooting in Dodge City 3 years ago? A man died." Catherine felt a chill run through her. "No, I didn't know that. But I'm sure there must be an explanation." "The explanation, according to my sources, is that Fletcher shot a man over a gambling dispute," Hollister said grimly. "The charges were eventually dropped. Witnesses said it was self-defense, but it speaks to his character, don't you think?" "I think," Catherine said carefully, "that you're going to remarkable lengths to investigate a man who's only been in town for a day." Hollister stepped closer. "I'm concerned for your safety, Catherine. You and your father have taken a virtual stranger into your home. Kyle is hardly a stranger. We've known him since he was a boy." "You knew a boy 20 years ago," Hollister corrected. "You don't know the man he's become. Men change out there on the frontier, and rarely for the better." Catherine crossed her arms. "Thank you for your concern, Sheriff, but I believe we're quite safe with Kyle under our roof." Hollister studied her face for a moment. "You care for him," he said flatly. "After just one day." "My feelings for Kyle are none of your concern," Catherine replied, her voice cooling further. "Perhaps not," Hollister conceded, replacing his hat. "But your safety is. Just be careful, Catherine. I'd hate to see you or your father get hurt because you trusted the wrong person." With that, he turned and strode back through the curtain, nodding briefly to Kyle and George before exiting the store. Catherine followed more slowly, her mind troubled by the sheriff's warning. When she emerged, Kyle was watching her with concern. "Everything all right?" he asked quietly when she approached the counter. "Fine," she said automatically, then reconsidered. "Actually, no. The sheriff seems to think you're some kind of dangerous gunslinger. He mentioned a shooting in Dodge City." Kyle's expression darkened. "Did he now? Is it true?" she pressed. Kyle glanced at George, who was still occupied with customers, then back to Catherine. "Yes and no. There was a shooting. A man pulled a gun on me after accusing me of cheating at cards. I wasn't faster, I was luckier. His gun misfired. You killed him." Catherine asked, struggling to reconcile this information with the man before her. "No," Kyle said firmly. "I wounded him. He died later of infection. The law cleared me completely. It was witnessed by half the saloon, including the marshal's deputy." Catherine studied his face, looking for any sign of deception. "Why would the sheriff bring this up now?" "Because he sees me as competition," Kyle said bluntly, "and he's right to worry." Before Catherine could respond, the door opened again, admitting Mrs. Whittaker, the banker's wife and the most notorious gossip in Copper Creek. Catherine was forced to plaster on a pleasant smile and attend to her, but her mind remained fixed on Kyle's words and the implications behind them. The rest of the day passed in a blur of customers and restocking shelves. By closing time, Catherine was both physically tired and emotionally drained. After dinner, she excused herself to prepare for the school council meeting, grateful for the chance to gather her thoughts away from Kyle's unsettling presence. As she pinned her hair more formally and changed into a fresh shirtwaist, Catherine confronted the turmoil inside her. In just 2 days, Kyle Fletcher had upended her carefully ordered life. His return had awakened feelings she'd thought long dead, not just the childish affection they'd once shared, but a deeper, more mature attraction to the man he'd become. But the sheriff's warning nagged at her. Had Kyle really been involved in a shooting? He'd admitted as much, though his version differed from Hollister's insinuations. And why would the sheriff go to such lengths to discredit Kyle unless he truly believed him to be dangerous, or unless Hollister's interest in Catherine herself went deeper than she'd realized? When she came downstairs, she found Kyle waiting by the door, hat in hand. "I thought I might walk you to the schoolhouse," he offered. "It's getting dark earlier these days." Catherine hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you. That would be nice." They walked in companionable silence through the twilight streets of Copper Creek. The evening air was cool, carrying the sense of cooking fires and blooming desert flowers. When they were nearly to the schoolhouse, Kyle finally spoke. "About what the sheriff told you." "You don't need to explain," Catherine said quickly. "I think I do," Kyle insisted. "I want you to know the truth, all of it, not just what Hollister chooses to share." He took a deep breath. "I'm not a gunfighter, Cat. I've never sought trouble, but I've lived in rough places, and sometimes trouble finds you whether you want it or not. Yes, there was an incident in Dodge City. A card game went bad. A drunk cowboy accused me of cheating and pulled a gun. His first shot missed. Mine didn't." "You carry a gun?" Catherine asked, realizing she hadn't seen him wearing one. "In my saddlebags," Kyle confirmed. "I haven't worn it in town out of respect for local customs. But yes, I know how to use one when necessary." "And you've had to use it. How many times?" Kyle's expression was somber. "3 times in 20 years, always in self-defense, always as a last resort." Catherine absorbed this information, trying to reconcile it with the gentle boy she'd known and the steadfast man who now walked beside her. "The frontier is a different world, Cat," Kyle continued softly. "Sometimes survival means making hard choices. But I've never been the kind of man Hollister is painting me as." "I believe you," Catherine said, surprising herself with how true it felt. "Though I don't understand why the sheriff would try to turn me against you." Kyle stopped walking, turning to face her directly. "Don't you? He's been courting you, however subtly. Then I show up someone with a prior claim on your affections, and suddenly he's digging into my past for anything he can use against me." Put that way, it made a disturbing kind of sense. "I've never encouraged him," Catherine said. "It doesn't matter," Kyle replied. "Men like Hollister see what they want to see, and he wants you, Cat." The intensity in Kyle's voice sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. Before she could respond, they reached the schoolhouse, where several other council members were already gathering. "I'll wait for you," Kyle said, releasing her arm. "Take your time." The meeting lasted longer than usual, with heated debate about how to allocate funds for new books versus repairs to the schoolhouse roof. By the time they finished, it was fully dark, the streets of Copper Creek lit only by the occasional lamp in a shop window and the stars overhead. Kyle was waiting patiently on the schoolhouse steps, just as he'd promised. When Catherine emerged, he stood and offered his arm. "How was the meeting?" he asked as they began the walk back to the store. "Contentious," Catherine sighed. "Half the council wants new books, the other half insists the leaking roof is more important." "And what do you think?" Catherine smiled in the darkness. "I think children can't read books if they're getting rained on, but they also can't learn if their books are outdated and falling apart." "A diplomatic answer," Kyle observed. "So what was decided?" "A compromise. We'll fix the worst of the roof now and order a smaller set of new readers. Neither side is completely happy, which probably means it's fair." They walked in silence for a few moments before Kyle spoke again. "You're good at this, Kat, finding the middle ground, seeing both sides." "It's just common sense," she demurred. "It's wisdom," Kyle corrected. "And it's one of the things I've always admired about you, even when we were kids." The compliment warmed her. "I don't remember being particularly wise as a child." "You were," Kyle insisted. "Remember when the Miller boys were fighting over that hunting knife, and you suggested they take turns with it week by week instead of cutting it in half like they were planning?" Catherine laughed at the memory. "I'd forgotten about that. Those boys weren't the brightest, were they?" "Not compared to you," Kyle agreed, his voice warm with admiration. As they approached the general store, Catherine noticed a figure sitting on the bench outside her father, enjoying his evening pipe. "Meeting run long." George called as they approached. "As always," Catherine confirmed. "The roof versus books debate." "Ah," George nodded sagely. "The eternal question. Did wisdom prevail?" "Your daughter's wisdom did," Kyle said, helping Catherine up the steps. "She brokered a compromise everyone could live with." George beamed with pride. "That's my girl, always the sensible one." He knocked the ash from his pipe and stood. "Well, I'm for bed. These old bones need more rest than they used to. Don't stay up too late, you two." After her father had gone inside, Catherine lingered on the porch, reluctant to end the evening. Kyle seemed equally disinclined to go in, leaning against the porch rail and looking up at the star-filled sky. "I've missed this," he said softly. "What?" "Copper Creek's thrilling school council meetings," Catherine teased. Kyle smiled. "No, this, talking with you, being with you, it's easy, natural." "It is, isn't it?" Catherine agreed, surprised by the realization. Despite 20 years apart, there was a comfort between them that she'd never found with anyone else. "In all my travels," Kyle said, his voice low and intimate in the darkness, "I never found anyone who understood me the way you always did, even as children." Catherine felt her heart quicken. "Kyle, I'm not trying to rush you," he assured her quickly. "I know you need time. I just want you to know that what I felt for you as a boy has only grown stronger as a man, and now that I've seen you again, talked with you again." He took a deep breath. "I'm more certain than ever that coming back for you was the right choice." Catherine didn't know how to respond. Part of her wanted to step into his arms and see if they fit together as perfectly as she imagined they might. Another part, the cautious, practical part that had guided her for 20 years, held her back. "It's late," she said finally. "We should go in." Kyle nodded, accepting her unspoken request for space. "Of course. Good night, Kat." "Good night, Kyle," she replied softly, and slipped inside, her mind and heart more conflicted than ever. The next few days fell into a pattern. Kyle helped in the store during the day, his natural charm winning over even the most skeptical customers. In the evenings, he and Catherine would often walk through town or sit on the porch, talking for hours about their lives, their dreams, and the years they'd spent apart. With each conversation, each shared laugh, each moment of unexpected connection, Catherine felt herself drawing closer to him. Sheriff Hollister continued to make his presence known, stopping by the store more frequently than usual, his gaze often lingering on Catherine while his questions were directed at Kyle. The tension between the two men was palpable, though both maintained a veneer of civility that grew increasingly thin. On Saturday evening, nearly a week after Kyle's arrival, the town was holding its monthly social at the newly built community hall. George insisted they all attend, overriding Catherine's half-hearted objections. "You haven't been to a social in months," her father pointed out, "and Kyle should meet more of the townspeople if he's staying for a while." And so Catherine found herself donning her best dress, a deep blue creation with modest lace at the collar and cuffs, and allowing Kyle to escort her and her father to the social. The community hall was festively decorated with paper lanterns and wildflowers. A small band played lively tunes in one corner, while tables laden with food and punch lined the opposite wall. It seemed most of Copper Creek had turned out for the event, the room buzzing with conversation and laughter. Catherine was immediately swept into conversations with friends and neighbors, many of whom were openly curious about Kyle. She couldn't help noticing the speculative glances cast their way, particularly from the unmarried women of the town. "So this is the boy you used to talk about so much," teased Martha Wilson, Catherine's closest friend and the milliner's wife. "I can see why you were heartbroken when he left." "I wasn't heartbroken," Catherine protested. "I was 10. Martha hummed skeptically. "And now he's back looking like that and you're not the least bit interested." Catherine felt her cheeks warm. "It's complicated, Martha." "Only if you make it so," her friend countered. "The man came back for you after 20 years. If that's not devotion, I don't know what is." Before Catherine could respond, the music changed to a waltz and Kyle appeared at her side. "May I have this dance?" he asked, extending his hand. Catherine hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in his. "You dance now? That's new." "I've picked up a few skills over the years," Kyle said with a smile, leading her onto the dance floor. "Though I'm still not as graceful as I'd like to be." Despite his modest disclaimer, Kyle proved to be a competent dancer, guiding Catherine smoothly around the floor. His hand was warm at her waist, his body close enough that she could catch the clean scent of soap and the faint aroma of leather that seemed to cling to him. "Everyone's watching us," Catherine murmured, acutely aware of the eyes following their movement. "Let them," Kyle replied, his gaze fixed solely on her. "I only care about one person's opinion in this room." The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "Kyle, we should talk about what happens next. You can't stay in Copper Creek indefinitely." "I can stay as long as it takes," he countered. "My foreman can handle things at the ranch for a few months if necessary." "And what exactly are you waiting for?" Catherine asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "For you to decide if what we could have is worth taking a chance on," Kyle said simply. "I told you before, Kat. I came back for you, to see if the connection we had as children could grow into something more as adults, and every day I spend with you convinces me more that it can." Before Catherine could formulate a response, the music ended, and a hand tapped Kyle firmly on the shoulder. They turned to find Sheriff Hollister standing there, his expression polite but his eyes hard. "May I cut in?" he asked, though it sounded more like a demand than a request. Kyle looked to Catherine, clearly willing to refuse if she preferred. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded. "Of course, Sheriff." As Kyle reluctantly released her, Hollister took his place, one hand at her waist, the other clasping her fingers more tightly than was comfortable. The band struck up another waltz and they began to move. "You look lovely tonight, Catherine," Hollister said, his eyes sweeping over her in a way that made her skin crawl slightly. "Thank you, Sheriff," she replied politely. "Tom," he corrected. "I think we know each other well enough to use first names, don't you?" Catherine didn't particularly agree but nodded anyway, wanting to keep the peace. "Tom, then. I've been meaning to speak with you privately," he continued as they moved around the floor. "About Fletcher." Catherine sighed. "If you have concerns about Kyle, perhaps you should address them to him directly." "I'm concerned about you," Hollister countered. "I've continued my inquiries about Fletcher's background. Did you know he was involved with a woman in Santa Fe 2 years ago, a widow with considerable property?" Catherine felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "No, I didn't know that, but Kyle's past is his own business. It becomes your business when he appears out of nowhere, claiming some childhood connection and starts courting you," Hollister argued. "Especially when the woman in Santa Fe lost her ranch to him in a very suspicious property deal before he disappeared." "I don't believe that," Catherine said firmly, though a seed of doubt had been planted. "Kyle wouldn't what? Take advantage of a woman's affections for financial gain." Hollister's voice was low, meant only for her ears. "Men do worse things every day, Catherine. Especially men who have spent their lives drifting from place to place, answering to no one." The dance ended, and Catherine stepped back quickly, needing distance from both Hollister and his insinuations. "If you'll excuse me, I need some air." She made her way through the crowd to the side door, stepping out onto the small porch that overlooked a garden area. The night air was cool against her flushed skin, carrying the scent of sage and night-blooming flowers. Catherine leaned against the railing, trying to sort through her troubled thoughts. Was Hollister telling the truth about Kyle's past? Or was he deliberately trying to drive a wedge between them? And if he was, why go to such lengths? The door opened behind her and Catherine turned, expecting to see Kyle. Instead, it was Martha, carrying 2 cups of punch. "Thought you might need this," her friend said, handing her one of the cups. "And maybe a friendly ear to go with it." Catherine accepted the punch gratefully. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who's known you for 15 years, Martha replied, leaning against the railing beside her. "Want to talk about it?" Catherine sighed. "I don't even know where to begin. How about with the handsome cowboy who came back for you after 20 years? Martha suggested. "Or maybe with the sheriff who looks like he wants to shoot said cowboy every time he gets within 10 feet of you." Despite her troubled thoughts, Catherine couldn't help but laugh. "You don't miss much, do you?" "Not when it comes to the most interesting gossip Copper Creek has seen in years," Martha confirmed with a grin. "Half the town is betting on whether you'll ride off into the sunset with your childhood sweetheart or settle down with our stern lawman." "And what's your bet?" Catherine asked wryly. Martha studied her for a moment. "I'm betting on the man who makes your eyes light up when he walks into a room, and honey, that isn't the sheriff." Catherine looked down into her punch cup, unable to deny her friend's observation. "It's not that simple, Martha. Kyle and I. We knew each other as children, but we're different people now, and the sheriff has been saying things. Tom Hollister would say the moon was made of green cheese if he thought it would keep you from leaving town with Fletcher," Martha said bluntly. "He's been sweet on you since the day he arrived, even if you've been too blind to see it. He claims Kyle was involved with a widow in Santa Fe," Catherine said softly, "that he somehow cheated her out of her property." Martha snorted inelegantly. "And you believe that? Has Fletcher given you any reason to think he's the type of man who would take advantage of a woman that way?" "No," Catherine admitted. "Just the opposite, in fact. He's been nothing but honorable since he arrived." "Then maybe you should ask him about it directly instead of letting Hollister poison your mind with gossip," Martha suggested. Seems to me a man who kept a promise for 20 years deserves at least the chance to defend himself. Catherine knew her friend was right. It wasn't fair to doubt Kyle based solely on Hollister's claims, especially when the sheriff clearly had his own motivations. "Thank you, Martha," she said sincerely. "I needed to hear that." "That's what friends are for," Martha replied, patting her arm. "Now, are you coming back inside? Because if you don't, I think those two men might actually come to blows over who gets to check on you next." Catherine laughed and linked her arm through her friend's. "We can't have that. It would ruin Mrs. Peterson's new dance floor." When they returned to the hall, Catherine immediately sought out Kyle, finding him in conversation with her father near the refreshment table. His face lit up when he saw her approach, reinforcing Martha's observation about the effect he had on her. "Everything all right?" he asked as she joined them. "You disappeared rather suddenly." "I just needed some fresh air," Catherine assured him. "It's warm in here with so many people." George excused himself to speak with the mayor, leaving Catherine and Kyle alone. "Would you like to dance again?" Kyle offered. "Or we could step outside for a while if you prefer." "Actually," Catherine said, gathering her courage, "I'd like to talk to you, privately." Kyle's expression grew serious as he nodded. "Of course." They found a relatively quiet corner of the hall, away from the dancers and the main crush of people. Catherine took a deep breath, deciding directness was the best approach. "The sheriff told me something about you," she began. "About a widow in Santa Fe." Kyle's expression darkened. "Did he now?" "He said you were involved with her and that you took advantage of her somehow, that she lost her ranch to you in a suspicious deal." For a moment Kyle was silent, his jaw tight with obvious tension. Then he let out a slow breath. "Her name was Elena Mendoza," he said quietly. "And yes, I knew her in Santa Fe 2 years ago. Her husband had been killed by raiders, leaving her with a ranch she couldn't manage alone and mounting debts." Catherine's heart sank. "So it's true. Not the way Hollister is painting it," Kyle said firmly. "Elena and I were friends, nothing more, despite what the gossips claimed. She needed to sell her ranch before the bank foreclosed. I offered to buy it at a fair price, enough to pay her debts and set her up comfortably in town near her sister." "And did you?" Catherine pressed. "Set her up comfortably. I did," Kyle confirmed. "Elena now owns a successful millinery shop in Santa Fe. We still exchange letters occasionally. She's remarried to the town doctor and expecting their first child this winter." The relief that washed over Catherine was so profound it almost made her dizzy. "I'm sorry I doubted you," she said softly. Kyle reached for her hand, holding it gently between both of his. "Don't be. You had every right to ask. I want you to know who I am, Cat, all of me, the good and the bad. I've made mistakes in my life, but taking advantage of a woman's trust has never been one of them." Catherine believed him. Despite 20 years apart, despite the sheriff's insinuations, despite her own natural caution, she knew in her heart that Kyle Fletcher was telling her the truth. "I think," she said slowly, "that Sheriff Hollister may be more interested in me than I realized." Kyle's expression was grim. "He is, and he sees me as a threat." "That doesn't give him the right to spread rumors about you," Catherine said, indignation rising within her. "No, it doesn't," Kyle agreed. "But men don't always behave rationally when it comes to matters of the heart." The implication behind his words hung in the air between them. Before Catherine could respond, the music changed to a livelier tune, and couples began forming sets for a Virginia reel. "Dance with me?" Kyle asked, the tension leaving his face. "For old time's sake," Catherine smiled, remembering how they'd practiced the steps of this very dance in her father's barn as children, giggling and tripping over their feet. "I'd like that very much." As they joined the other dancers, Catherine caught sight of Sheriff Hollister watching them from across the room, his expression unreadable. For the first time, she allowed herself to acknowledge that the tension between Kyle and the sheriff wasn't just about her. It was about two fundamentally different types of men, with different values and different ways of moving through the world. And as Kyle's hand found hers in the pattern of the dance, his smile bright and genuine in the lamplight, Catherine began to recognize which kind of man she preferred. The social continued late into the evening, but by the time they walked home under a canopy of stars, Catherine had made a decision. She wasn't ready to leave Copper Creek, not yet. But she was ready to give Kyle the chance he'd asked for, to see if the connection they'd shared as children could truly blossom into something deeper as adults. When they reached the store, George headed upstairs immediately, claiming exhaustion, but Catherine lingered on the porch with Kyle. "I owe you an apology," she said once they were alone. "I should have asked you directly about the widow instead of letting the sheriff's words affect me." "You don't owe me anything," Kyle assured her. "Hollister is the town sheriff. It's natural you'd give weight to his words." "Perhaps," Catherine acknowledged. "But I know you, Kyle. Or at least, I'm coming to know the man you've become. And that man doesn't match the picture the sheriff was painting." Kyle stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool night air. "And what kind of man do you see, Catherine looked up at him, studying the face that had become so dear to her in such a short time. "I see a man who keeps his promises, no matter how long it takes. A man who's worked hard and built something meaningful with his life. A man who's kind and honest and—" She hesitated, then finished softly, "and who still makes my heart beat faster when he walks into a room." The confession hung between them for a breathless moment. Then Kyle reached up, his hand gentle as he cupped her cheek. "I've waited 20 years to hear you say something like that," he murmured. "I've waited 20 years to feel something worth saying it for," Catherine replied honestly. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Kyle lowered his head until his lips met hers in a kiss that was both tentative and tender. Catherine's eyes fluttered closed as she leaned into him, her hands coming to rest against his chest. The kiss deepened, becoming something more profound than Catherine had ever experienced. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Kyle rested his forehead against hers. "I've imagined that moment more times than I can count," he admitted with a smile in his voice. "Reality is much better." Catherine laughed softly. "Much better," she agreed. They stood together in the starlight for a long moment, neither wanting to break the spell that seemed to envelop them. Finally, Catherine reluctantly stepped back. "I should go in," she said. "It's late." Kyle nodded, though he kept hold of her hand. "Will you ride with me tomorrow? There's somewhere I'd like to show you." "I'd like that," Catherine said. "After church?" "After church," Kyle confirmed, bringing her hand to his lips for one more gentle kiss before releasing it. "Sweet dreams, Cat." "Sweet dreams, Kyle," she replied. And this time, she knew they would be. The next morning dawned clear and bright, perfect for their planned ride after church services. Catherine found herself paying less attention to Reverend Thompson's sermon than she should have, her thoughts drifting repeatedly to Kyle beside her in the pew, and the memory of his kiss the night before. After the service, they faced the usual round of greetings and small talk with neighbors. Catherine couldn't help noticing the speculative glances cast their way, nor the fact that Kyle stayed close to her side throughout, his hand occasionally brushing hers in a way that seemed both protective and possessive. Sheriff Hollister was also at church, his gaze following them as they made their way through the crowd. When they reached the steps outside, he intercepted them. "Miss Vaughn, Mr. Fletcher," he nodded curtly. "Fine sermon today." "Indeed," Catherine agreed politely. "If you'll excuse us, Sheriff, we have plans this afternoon." "Of course," Hollister said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "I just wanted to mention that I've received word the McAllister gang was spotted near Silver Springs yesterday. I'd advise against traveling too far from town for the time being." "We'll keep that in mind," Kyle replied evenly. "Thank you for the warning." As they walked away, Catherine could feel Hollister's eyes boring into their backs. "Do you think he's telling the truth about the gang?" she asked quietly. "Probably," Kyle admitted. "The McAllisters are real enough, and they've been causing trouble throughout the territory. But where we're going isn't far, and I'll be armed." They retrieved horses from the livery stable, Kyle's own mount, a handsome bay gelding, and a gentle mare that Catherine often borrowed for rides outside town. Within half an hour they were leaving Copper Creek behind, riding side by side along a trail that wound through the scrubby hills to the east. "Where are we going?" Catherine asked as they crested a small rise. "Somewhere special," Kyle replied with a mysterious smile. "You'll see." The day was perfect for riding, with a light breeze tempering the heat of the sun. Catherine found herself relaxing, enjoying the rhythm of the horse beneath her and Kyle's companionable presence beside her. They talked easily as they rode, sharing stories and observations, laughing together in a way that bridged the 20-year gap in their friendship. After about an hour, Kyle led them off the main trail, following a less distinct path that wound up into rockier terrain. When they rounded a final bend, Catherine gasped at the view that opened before them. They had emerged onto a small plateau overlooking a hidden valley. Below, a stream cut through lush greenery, creating an oasis in the otherwise arid landscape. The surrounding hills cupped the valley like protective hands, and in the distance, mountains rose in purple majesty against the sky. "It's beautiful," Catherine breathed, reining her horse to a stop beside Kyle's. "I found this place when I was 9, Kyle said, his voice soft with memory. "The summer before my family left. I used to ride out here when I needed to think or be alone. I never showed it to anyone else." "Not even me?" Catherine asked, touched by the significance of his bringing her here now. "I was saving it," Kyle admitted with a slight smile, "for when we were older. I always planned to bring you here someday." They dismounted and let the horses graze while Kyle spread a blanket in the shade of a juniper tree. From his saddlebags, he produced a simple picnic bread, cheese, apples, and a canteen of cool water. As they ate, looking out over the hidden valley, Catherine felt a peace settle over her that had been missing for longer than she could remember. There was something right about being here with Kyle, as if the universe had been patiently waiting for them to find their way back to each other. "I used to imagine my future ranch would look something like this," Kyle said, gesturing toward the valley. "Protected with good water, good grazing, a place where a family could thrive." "And does it?" Catherine asked. "Your ranch in New Mexico?" Kyle nodded. "In many ways, yes. Though the mountains are closer and the creek is wider. But the feeling is the same, like a place that's waiting to be fully lived in." The implication behind his words hung in the air between them. Catherine looked out over the valley, trying to imagine what it would be like to leave Copper Creek, to leave her father, the store, the life she'd built, and start anew in a place she'd never seen. "Tell me more about it," she requested. "Your home." Kyle's face lit up as he described the ranch in detail, the house he'd built room by room, the barn with its hayloft that reminded him of where they used to hide as children, the cottonwoods that lined the creek, the way the sunset painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. "It sounds wonderful," Catherine said when he finished. "You've built something real there." "I have," Kyle agreed, "but it's not complete yet." He reached for her hand, his expression growing serious. "It needs a heart, Cat, someone to make it truly a home." Catherine's breath caught at the naked longing in his eyes. "Kyle, I'm not asking for an answer today," he said quickly. "I know it's a lot to consider. Leaving your father, the store, everything you've known. I just want you to know that everything I built with you in mind. Even when I wasn't sure I'd ever see you again, even when I thought you might have married someone else long ago, it was always for you." The depth of his devotion humbled her. "Why did you wait so long to come back?" she asked softly. Kyle was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "Pride, at first," he admitted. "I wanted to come back successful, to prove to you and to myself that I could make something of my life. Then, as the years passed, I started to worry that you might have forgotten me, or that the memory of our childhood friendship wouldn't be enough to bridge the gap of time." "I never forgot you," Catherine confessed. "I waited at the edge of town every spring for 5 years, watching for your return. Eventually, I had to accept that you weren't coming back, that our childhood promises were just that, the dreams of children who didn't understand how the world works." "I'm sorry I made you wait so long," Kyle said, squeezing her hand. "If I could do it over again, I'd have come back for you years ago, successful or not." "Would you?" Catherine asked, genuinely curious. "Even if it meant you wouldn't have your ranch, your success?" "In a heartbeat," Kyle said without hesitation. "Because what good is any of it without someone to share it with? Without you to share it with?" The simple honesty in his voice moved her deeply. Catherine looked at this man who had carried his childhood promise through 20 years of hardship and adventure, who had built his life around a dream that included her, and felt the last of her reservations begin to crumble. "I need to think," she said softly. "This is all happening so fast." "Take all the time you need," Kyle assured her. "I've waited 20 years. I can wait a little longer for you to be sure." They spent the rest of the afternoon in the peaceful sanctuary of the hidden valley, talking, laughing, and occasionally lapsing into comfortable silence. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, they reluctantly packed up their picnic and mounted their horses for the ride back to town. They were about halfway to Copper Creek when they heard the sound of approaching riders. Kyle reined in his horse, holding up a hand for Catherine to do the same. "Someone's coming," he said quietly, his expression suddenly alert. A group riding fast. Catherine felt a flutter of anxiety. "The McAllister gang." "Maybe," Kyle conceded, guiding his horse off the trail into the shelter of some rocks. Catherine followed quickly. "Let's wait and see." They didn't have to wait long. 5 riders came into view, moving at a gallop along the trail. Even from a distance, Catherine could see they were rough-looking men, dusty and trail-worn, with bandanas pulled up over the lower half of their faces. "That's them," Kyle whispered, his hand moving to the gun he now wore openly at his hip. "Stay quiet." Catherine nodded, her heart pounding as the riders drew closer. For a terrifying moment she thought they'd been spotted, but the gang thundered past without slowing, heading in the direction of Copper Creek. "They're going to town," Catherine said, fear gripping her heart. "Pa is there. We have to warn them." Kyle's expression was grim. "We'll take a shortcut. There's a deer trail through those hills that will get us to town ahead of them if we hurry." They set off at a gallop, Kyle leading the way along a barely visible path that cut through the rugged terrain. Catherine clung to her saddle, trying to keep up with Kyle's more experienced riding while her mind raced with worry for her father and the town. The shortcut proved as effective as Kyle had promised. They emerged on the outskirts of Copper Creek, just as the church bell began to ring in alarm someone had spotted the approaching gang. The town was in chaos as they rode in. People were running for cover, shopkeepers hurriedly barricading their doors and windows. Sheriff Hollister stood in the middle of the street, organizing a group of armed townsmen. Catherine and Kyle rode directly to the general store, where they found George frantically loading an old shotgun. "Thank God you're back," he said when they burst through the door. "The McAllister gang's been spotted heading this way. Sheriff's organizing men to defend the bank." "We saw them on the trail," Kyle explained quickly. 5 riders, all armed." George's face paled. 5. Hollister said he counted 3 approaching from the north. Kyle and Catherine exchanged alarmed glances. "They've split up," Kyle realized. "They're coming from multiple directions." "We need to warn the sheriff," Catherine said, already turning toward the door. "You stay here with your father," Kyle countermanded. "Bar the doors and stay away from the windows. I'll find Hollister." Before Catherine could protest, Kyle was gone, running toward the center of town where the sheriff and his makeshift deputies were gathered. George moved to secure the door, sliding heavy bolts into place. "Help me with the shutters," he instructed Catherine. Together, they worked quickly to close and bar the wooden shutters over the store's large front windows. Through the gaps, Catherine could see men taking positions behind water troughs, wagon wheels, and other makeshift cover along the main street. "I should be out there helping," George fretted, checking his shotgun for the 3rd time. "Your eyes aren't what they used to be, Pa," Catherine reminded him gently. "You'd be more likely to hit a townsperson than an outlaw." A sudden volley of gunfire erupted from the north end of town. Catherine flinched at the sound, her hands instinctively covering her ears. "It started," George said grimly. The next few minutes were the longest of Catherine's life. Gunshots echoed through the town, punctuated by shouts and the occasional scream. Unable to see what was happening, she and her father could only wait, straining to interpret the chaos from the sounds alone. Then, abruptly, there was silence. Catherine and George exchanged worried glances. Had the fight ended so quickly? And who had prevailed? A heavy knock at the door made them both jump. "Catherine, Mr. Vaughn," Kyle's voice called. "It's over. You can open up." Relief flooding through her, Catherine hurried to unbolt the door. Kyle stood outside, his face streaked with dirt and what looked alarmingly like blood. "You're hurt," she exclaimed, pulling him inside. "Not mine," Kyle assured her, though he winced slightly as he moved. "Just a graze along the ribs, nothing serious." "What happened?" George demanded. "Did they rob the bank?" Kyle shook his head. "They tried." Hollister and his men were waiting at the bank, but they didn't expect the second group coming from the east, if we hadn't warned them in time. He let the implication hang in the air. "The gang?" Catherine asked. "2 dead, 3 wounded and captured," Kyle reported. "No townspeople killed, though Doc Jenkins is going to be busy tonight. Several men took minor wounds." "And the sheriff?" George inquired. "Shot in the shoulder," Kyle said. "He'll live, but he's in a foul mood. Seems to think I brought the gang down on the town somehow." "That's absurd," Catherine protested. "If not for you, it could have been much worse." Kyle shrugged, then winced again at the movement. "Let's just say the sheriff and I aren't likely to become friends anytime soon." "Let me look at that wound," Catherine insisted, already moving to fetch the medical supplies they kept behind the counter. "It's really not necessary," Kyle began, but fell silent at Catherine's stern look. "Shirt off," she commanded. "Now." With a resigned sigh, Kyle unbuttoned his shirt and slipped it carefully from his shoulders. Catherine tried to maintain a professional demeanor. As she examined the wound, a shallow furrow along his right ribs where a bullet had grazed him, but she couldn't help noticing the lean strength of his torso, tanned and muscled from years of physical labor. "This needs cleaning," she said, keeping her voice steady with effort. "It might sting a bit." Kyle hardly flinched as she cleaned the wound with whiskey and applied a salve, his eyes never leaving her face. "You've done this before," he observed. "Living in a frontier town has its educational moments," Catherine replied, carefully wrapping a bandage around his ribs. "There. That should hold until Doc Jenkins has time to look at it properly." "Thank you," Kyle said softly, catching her hand as she finished securing the bandage. "For taking care of me." The intimacy of the moment was broken by George clearing his throat. "I'll just go see how the rest of the town is faring," he announced, heading for the door with transparent intent to give them privacy. Once they were alone, Kyle kept hold of Catherine's hand, his expression growing serious. "Today could have gone very differently," he said quietly. "When those shots started flying, all I could think about was getting back to you, making sure you were safe." Catherine understood exactly what he meant. Her own thoughts had been consumed with worry for him from the moment he'd left to warn the sheriff. "I was afraid for you too," she admitted. "Life is unpredictable, Kat," Kyle continued. "Especially out here. Today reminded me of that. We never know how much time we have." "What are you saying?" Catherine asked, though her heart was already racing with anticipation. Kyle took a deep breath. "I'm saying I don't want to waste any more time. 20 years was long enough." He looked directly into her eyes. "I love you, Catherine Vaughn. I think I've loved you since we were children, and seeing you again, getting to know the woman you've become, has only deepened that feeling." Catherine felt tears spring to her eyes at the simple, heartfelt declaration. "Kyle, I'm not asking you to decide right now about coming back to New Mexico with me," he continued. "But I am asking if you might consider a future where we're together, wherever that might be. Because I've tried living without you, Kat, and even with all I've built, it's a half-life at best." The last of Catherine's reservations melted away. In that moment of clarity, she knew that the path forward, the only path that would lead to true happiness, was with Kyle. "I love you too," she said, the words coming easily now that she'd finally allowed herself to acknowledge the truth. "I think I've been waiting for you all my life, even when I told myself I wasn't." The joy that spread across Kyle's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He pulled her gently into his arms, mindful of his injured side, and kissed her with a tenderness that spoke volumes about the depth of his feelings. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Kyle rested his forehead against hers. "Does this mean you'll consider coming to New Mexico with me as my wife?" Catherine smiled, her heart fuller than she'd ever thought possible. "I'll do more than consider it," she promised. "But first, we need to figure out what to do about Pa in the store. I won't leave him without making sure he's provided for." "We'll work it out together," Kyle assured her. "Whatever it takes to make this right for everyone." In that moment, with the future stretching before them like an open road, Catherine knew they would indeed find a way. The promise made by two 10-year-old children under an oak tree had taken 20 years to fulfill. But some promises, it seemed, were worth waiting for. The aftermath of the McAllister gang's attempted robbery brought unexpected changes to Copper Creek. With the gang's leaders captured or killed, the territory marshal arrived to transport the prisoners to the territorial capital for trial. Sheriff Hollister, his arm in a sling, received official commendation for his role in thwarting the robbery, though many in town quietly acknowledged that Kyle's timely warning had been equally crucial to their success. In the days that followed, Catherine and Kyle's relationship became the talk of the town. Their storied childhood friends reunited after 20 years, captured the romantic imagination of Copper Creek's residents. Even those who had initially viewed Kyle with suspicion now greeted him warmly, especially after his actions during the McAllister incident. Only Sheriff Hollister maintained his distance, his expression cold whenever he encountered Kyle and Catherine together. Catherine had attempted to thank him for his bravery during the robbery, but his response had been curt and dismissive. "Just doing my job, Miss Vaughn," he'd said stiffly. "Though I'd appreciate it if your friend would stop interfering in town business." 2 weeks after the robbery, Catherine and Kyle sat with George in the parlor above the store, discussing their future plans. Outside, a summer thunderstorm rumbled over the distant hills, bringing the promise of rain to the parched landscape. "I've been thinking," George said, setting aside his newspaper, "about the store and what happens next." Catherine exchanged a glance with Kyle. They had been carefully broaching the subject of their plans to marry and eventually return to Kyle's ranch, but George had seemed reluctant to discuss the practical implications for the store. "What are your thoughts, Pa?" Catherine asked carefully. George leaned back in his chair, looking more thoughtful than upset. "I've run Vaughn's general store for 35 years, built it from nothing when this town was just a few shacks and a lot of hope. It's been my life's work." "And you've done a magnificent job," Catherine said softly. "This town wouldn't be what it is without you and the store." "Maybe so," George acknowledged, "but I'm not getting any younger. These old eyes aren't what they used to be, and my back complains more than it doesn't these days." He looked directly at Kyle. "You love my daughter." It wasn't a question, but Kyle answered anyway. "Yes, sir, more than anything." "And you want to take her back to your ranch in New Mexico?" "If she'll have me," Kyle confirmed, "but we don't want to leave you in a difficult position." The store has served its purpose," George interrupted. "It provided for my family, gave Catherine a home and security after her mother passed, but it's not her passion, never has been." He turned to Catherine. "You stay because of duty and love for your old father." "But I've seen you these past weeks, daughter. You're happier than I've seen you in 20 years. Catherine felt tears spring to her eyes. "Pa, let me finish," George said gently. "I've had an offer for the store, Martha's nephew, you remember James. He's been working for that big mercantile in Tucson. Wants to come back to a smaller town, bring his young family. He's got good business sense and enough capital to buy me out fair and square." Catherine stared at her father in surprise. "You're thinking of selling? When did this happen?" "Been corresponding with him for a couple of months," George admitted. "Even before Kyle showed up, I've been thinking about retirement for a while now." "But where would you go?" Catherine asked, concern evident in her voice. "What would you do?" George smiled, looking more relaxed than she'd seen him in years. "Well, that depends. I hear New Mexico's a fine territory, good climate for these old bones. Might be nice to have a rocking chair on a porch overlooking some mountains. If there's room for an old shopkeeper, that is." Kyle's face broke into a wide grin. "There's always room for family, sir. Always." "Family, is it?" George raised an eyebrow. "Has something been decided that I should know about?" Kyle glanced at Catherine, who nodded encouragingly. "I've asked Catherine to marry me, Mr. Vaughn. And I'd like your blessing." "About time," George huffed, though his eyes twinkled. "I was beginning to think you two would dance around each other forever." He leaned forward, his expression growing serious. "You have my blessing, Kyle. But I want your promise that you'll cherish her as she deserves to be cherished." "Every day of my life," Kyle vowed solemnly. "Then it's settled," George declared, slapping his knees decisively. "I'll accept James's offer. We'll close up shop here and the three of us will start fresh in New Mexico." Catherine moved to embrace her father, her heart overflowing with gratitude and love. "Are you sure, Pa? This is your home." "Home is where family is," George said simply, patting her back. "And my family, it seems, is heading to New Mexico." The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. The sale of the store was finalized, with James and his family set to take over by the end of summer. Word of Catherine and Kyle's engagement spread through town, leading to a flurry of well wishes and a hastily organized engagement party at the community hall. Even amid the celebration, Catherine couldn't help noticing Sheriff Hollister's conspicuous absence. Though his shoulder was healing well, he had withdrawn from social activities, focusing solely on his duties. Catherine had tried to speak with him to clear the air, but he had politely rebuffed her attempts. It was Martha who finally explained the situation, cornering Catherine in the millinery shop where she'd gone to order a hat for the journey to New Mexico. "Tom Hollister is leaving town," Martha announced without preamble as she measured Catherine's head for the hat. "Leaving?" Catherine echoed in surprise. "But why? He's been sheriff here for 5 years." Martha gave her a knowing look. "Don't play naive, Catherine. The man's been sweet on you since he arrived. Now you're marrying someone else and leaving town. His pride can't take it." "That's ridiculous," Catherine protested. "The sheriff and I were never more than acquaintances." "In his mind you were more," Martha said firmly. "Or at least you would have been eventually. He had a plan, our Sheriff Hollister. Told my Henry once that he was saving to buy land outside town, planning to build a house that would tempt a certain shopkeeper's daughter away from that dusty store." Catherine felt a mixture of surprise and discomfort at this revelation. "I had no idea he was that serious." "Men don't always say what they're thinking," Martha observed, pinning a length of ribbon to the hat she was creating. "Especially the proud ones." "Where will he go?" Catherine asked, genuinely concerned despite their differences. "Word is the territorial governor offered him a position as a marshal. More responsibility, better pay." Martha set aside her pins and studied Catherine's face. "You're not reconsidering, are you? Because if Kyle Fletcher loses you twice, I don't think his heart could take it." "No," Catherine exclaimed. "Not at all. I love Kyle. I'm just sorry if Sheriff Hollister is leaving because of me." "Don't flatter yourself too much," Martha said with a smile to soften her words. "Tom Hollister is an ambitious man. He was bound to move on eventually. You just gave him the push he needed to accept an offer he might have been considering anyway." Catherine nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced. Still, there was nothing to be done about it now. Her path was set, her heart committed. Whatever regrets Sheriff Hollister might have were his own to manage. 2 days before they were scheduled to leave for New Mexico, Catherine was in the store helping James's wife arrange the new inventory when the door opened, admitting Sheriff Hollister. His arm was no longer in a sling, though he still moved it carefully. "Miss Vaughn," he nodded politely, "might I have a word?" In private, Catherine glanced at Mrs. Parker, who nodded encouragingly. "Of course, Sheriff. We can speak in the back room." Once they were alone among the crates and barrels of the storeroom, Hollister removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. "I understand congratulations are in order," he said stiffly. "For your engagement." "Thank you," Catherine replied, equally formal. "And I understand you've accepted a position as territorial marshal. Congratulations to you as well." Hollister nodded, a tight smile briefly crossing his face. "Yes, it's a good opportunity. Chance to make a difference on a larger scale." An awkward silence fell between them. Catherine waited, sensing there was more he wanted to say. "I owe you an apology," Hollister finally continued, his voice low, "for my behavior regarding Fletcher. I let personal feelings interfere with professional judgment." Surprised by the admission, Catherine studied his face. "You were doing what you thought was right to protect the town." "No," Hollister shook his head. "I was doing what I thought might keep you from leaving with him. It was selfish and unworthy of the badge I wear." The honesty of his confession moved her. "Thank you for telling me this, Sheriff." "It can't have been easy." "Tom," he corrected quietly, "since I'll no longer be your sheriff soon." "Tom," Catherine acknowledged with a small smile. He looked at her for a long moment as if memorizing her face. "He's a good man, your Kyle. I didn't want to see it, but he is." proved it during the McAllister incident. Yes, he is, Catherine agreed softly. Be happy, Catherine, Hollister said, replacing his hat. That's all I ever wanted for you, even if I had selfish ideas about who should make you happy. I wish the same for you, she replied sincerely. You deserve someone who will appreciate all your good qualities. A shadow of regret crossed his face, quickly masked. Perhaps in my new posting. Farewell, Catherine. I wish you and Fletcher all the best. With that, he turned and left, his shoulders straight and his head high. Catherine watched him go, feeling a mixture of sadness and relief. Whatever might have been between them had never truly had a chance to develop, overshadowed by the deeper connection she shared with Kyle. But she hoped sincerely that Thomas Hollister would find happiness in his new role and, perhaps someday, with someone who could return his feelings. The morning of their departure dawned clear and cool, with the promise of heat later in the day. The wagon was loaded with their essential belongings, the rest would follow by freight wagon later, and Kyle's bay gelding was saddled and ready beside it. Half the town seemed to have gathered to see them off. Martha embraced Catherine tearfully, pressing a parcel into her hands. Your wedding hat, she explained, since I won't be there to see you wear it. Oh, Martha, Catherine hugged her friend tightly, I'll miss you terribly. Write to me, Martha insisted. I want to hear all about your new life and visit when you can. Similar farewells repeated throughout the crowd, handshakes for George and Kyle, embraces for Catherine, good wishes all around. Even James and his wife were there, already looking comfortable in their role as the town's new merchants. As Kyle helped Catherine up to the wagon seat beside her father, she scanned the crowd one last time. Near the back, standing apart from the others, was Sheriff Hollister. When their eyes met, he touched the brim of his hat in silent farewell. Catherine nodded in acknowledgement, grateful for the closure their conversation had provided. Kyle swung up onto his horse beside the wagon. Ready? He asked, his eyes finding Catherine's. Looking at the man who had kept his promise against all odds, who had returned for her after 20 years, Catherine felt her heart swell with love and anticipation for the future they would build together. Ready, she confirmed with a smile that held no reservations. With a final wave to the townspeople of Copper Creek, they set off down the road, heading south toward the future that awaited them in New Mexico territory. The journey to Kyle's ranch took just over 2 weeks. They traveled at a leisurely pace, mindful of George's age and the need to avoid overtaxing the horses pulling the wagon. Each evening, they made camp beside the trail, and Kyle would tell stories of his adventures while they sat around the campfire. Catherine found herself falling more deeply in love with him with each passing day, discovering new facets of the man he'd become during their years apart. As they crossed into New Mexico territory, the landscape began to change. The mountains grew taller, the valleys greener. Kyle pointed out landmarks along the way, his excitement growing as they drew closer to his home. Just over that ridge, he said on the morning of the 15th day, gesturing toward a distant line of hills. Once we cross those, we'll be able to see the ranch. By mid-afternoon, they had crested the ridge, and the valley beyond spread out before them like a painting. Catherine gasped at the beauty of it, a wide expanse of grassland cradled by mountains, a creek winding through it like a silver ribbon, and in the distance, a cluster of buildings that must be the ranch house and outbuildings. It's even more beautiful than you described, she breathed, taking in the peaceful scene. Welcome home, Cat, Kyle said softly, reaching across from his horse to take her hand. As they descended into the valley, Catherine could see figures moving around the ranch buildings, noticing their approach. By the time they reached the house, a welcoming committee had assembled Kyle's foreman, the ranch hands, and the cook who kept house for Kyle. "Boss." The foreman called, stepping forward to take the reins of Kyle's horse. "Beginning to think you weren't coming back." "Just took a little longer than expected, Miguel," Kyle replied with a grin, dismounting and moving to help Catherine down from the wagon. "But well worth the wait." He made introductions all around, his pride evident as he presented Catherine and George to the people who had helped him build his dream. Everyone was welcoming, though Catherine detected curiosity in their glances clearly. Kyle's sudden departure and return with a fiancé and future father-in-law had been the subject of speculation during his absence. The house itself was larger than Catherine had expected, a sprawling single-story structure built of adobe and timber, with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Inside, it was simply but comfortably furnished, with large windows that captured the mountain views. "I built it room by room," Kyle explained as he showed them around. "Started with just 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen. Added on as I could afford it." He showed George to a bedroom at one end of the house, with its own small sitting area and a view of the mountains. "I thought you might like this space," he said. "It gets the morning sun and there's room for your books." George looked around with approval. "This will do nicely," he declared. "Very nicely indeed." Catherine's room was on the opposite side of the house, for propriety's sake. Kyle explained with a slight blush. "Until the wedding." It was a lovely space, with a handmade quilt on the bed and wildflowers in a vase on the dresser. "Maria, our cook, put those there when I sent word we were a day away," Kyle said, noticing Catherine's attention on the flowers. "She was quite excited to hear I was bringing home a bride." "It's perfect," Catherine said softly, turning to face him. "All of it. Thank you for building this place, for making it ready for us." Kyle crossed the room to stand before her, taking both her hands in his. "Thank you for coming home with me," he replied, "for making my house a home at last." The kiss they shared was sweet with promise, a pledge of the life they would build together in this beautiful valley. The next weeks were filled with adjustments and discoveries, as Catherine and George settled into life at the ranch. George quickly found his place, spending mornings on the porch with his books and afternoons helping Kyle keep the ranch accounts in better order than they'd ever been. His experience as a merchant proved invaluable as they planned for the fall cattle sale and calculated the supplies needed for the coming winter. Catherine, meanwhile, threw herself into learning everything she could about the ranch and the surrounding area. Kyle taught her to ride better than she ever had before, and together they explored the boundaries of his property. She made friends with Maria, learning to cook the local dishes and adding her own recipes to the ranch's repertoire. She even persuaded Kyle to set aside one room of the house as a small classroom, where she could teach the children of the ranch hands to read and write. 6 weeks after their arrival, on a perfect September morning with the aspens beginning to turn gold on the mountainsides, Catherine Vaughn became Catherine Fletcher in a simple ceremony on the porch of their home. The ranch hands and their families gathered to witness the event, along with neighbors from miles around who had ridden in for the occasion. George gave his daughter away with tears in his eyes, and the local circuit preacher pronounced them man and wife. 20 years late, Kyle whispered as he slipped the ring onto her finger, but right on time. Catherine wore Martha's wedding hat and her mother's locket, old and new combined, as she stepped into her future. The celebration lasted well into the night, with music and dancing under the stars, but eventually, the guests departed or settled into the bunkhouse and guest rooms prepared for them. Finally alone in what was now their bedroom, Catherine and Kyle stood facing each other in the soft lamplight, both suddenly shy despite the weeks of anticipation. "Mrs. Fletcher," Kyle said softly, reaching up to unpin her hair. "I've waited a lifetime to call you that." "It was worth the wait," Catherine replied, her heart racing as his fingers combed gently through her loosened hair. Their first night together, as husband and wife, was everything Catherine had dreamed it might be: tender, passionate, and filled with the deep love that had survived 20 years of separation to bloom more strongly than ever. As they lay together afterward, Catherine's head resting on Kyle's chest while he stroked her hair, she marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. "When we were children," she murmured, "did you ever truly believe we'd end up here, together like this?" Kyle's hand stilled for a moment as he considered. "Yes," he said simply. "Even at 10 years old, I knew there would never be anyone for me but you. That's why I made that promise under the oak tree. I always intended to keep it." Catherine propped herself up on one elbow to look into his face. "And now that you have, now that the promise is fulfilled," the smile that spread across Kyle's face was filled with love and certainty. "Now we make new promises, Kat, and keep them together every day for the rest of our lives." As the years passed, the Fletcher ranch prospered and grew. Under Kyle and Catherine's joint stewardship, they expanded their holdings, improved their breeding stock, and became known throughout the territory for the quality of their cattle and the fairness of their business dealings. George lived with them for 8 happy years, becoming a beloved figure in the community and especially adored by the children who came to the ranch for Catherine's lessons. When he passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73, he was mourned by all who had known him, but none more deeply than his daughter and son-in-law. "He was happy here," Kyle assured Catherine as they stood beside the grave they had prepared on a gentle rise overlooking the valley. "He told me many times that coming here with us gave him the best years of his life since your mother passed." Catherine nodded through her tears. "I know, and I'm grateful we had this time with him." Life moved forward as it always does. A year after George's passing, Catherine gave birth to twins, a boy they named George Samuel after both their fathers, and a girl called Mary Elizabeth after their mothers. Though Catherine was 38 when they were born, considered late for a first pregnancy, both children were healthy and strong, bringing new joy to the ranch. As the twins grew, so did the Fletcher legacy. They expanded the schoolroom to accommodate more children from neighboring ranches, eventually hiring a full-time teacher while Catherine focused on running the household and helping Kyle manage their growing enterprise. Letters arrived regularly from Copper Creek, keeping them connected to their past even as they built their future. Sometimes, in the quiet evenings when the children were asleep and the work of the day was done, Catherine and Kyle would sit on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, just as Kyle had once described to her in Copper Creek. "You ever regret it?" Kyle asked once, his arm around her shoulders as they sat together. "Leaving your home, your life there, to come here with me?" Catherine looked out over the valley that had become more home to her than Copper Creek had ever been, then up at the face of the man who had kept his promise against all odds. "Never," she said with absolute certainty. "This is where I was always meant to be, with you." And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Catherine Fletcher said a silent thank you to the 10-year-old boy and girl who had carved their initials into an oak tree and made a promise that would take 20 years to fulfill, but that would create a lifetime of happiness when it did.